Richard Skipper celebrates. Every show is a celebration. Each show, Richard delivers the artists you love, showcasing what makes them unique. Never gossipy. The antidote to a sometimes hectic world. Now, here's your host, Richard Skipper.
Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Richard Skipper Celebrates. It's the last day of March. We'll see if it goes out like a lion. But anyway, I'm so excited to be here today because I get to celebrate a wonderful guy in his own right, and that's Eddie Shapiro. Eddie, a few years ago, put together an incredible book celebrating the leading ladies of Broadway. And what's leading lady without a leading man? So this is the companion piece. I hope that you enjoy our show today. Thank you for being here. By all means, if you like today's show, please hit the subscribe button on Richard Skipper Celebrates and leave a comment and hit the like button. We're going to be celebrating all things Broadway today. As I said, what's a leading lady without a leading man? What's Bess without Porgy? I'm stealing from your copy here.
Go for it. Steal away.
No, what's Dolly without a Horace? What's Mama Rose without a Herbie? What's Richard Skipper today without Eddie Shapiro? Nothing.
Oh, Richard Skipper. I'm still caught up in the introduction, Richard, which I listened to, and it said, not gossipy. I thought, not gossipy. Oh, I have to recalibrate everything.
If you desire to go gossipy today, that will be your choice. But I'm all about celebrating artists and their body of worth. And that includes you, of course, Eddie. I do want to start with where we are. Unfortunately, in this crazy world that we're in. Today marks 383 days since our theaters went dark. It's hard to believe. I have the same response that you do. And before we delve into your life and your love of theater, I want to ask, how are you doing really in the midst of this crazy world that we're now in?
Thank you for asking. And I can't complain. I sort of feel like, much like you, Richard, in this time, you started the show. You figured out, okay, what can I do? How can I feel like I have some structure and I have a reason to get up and I can contribute something? I feel the same way. I've kept myself busy. I finished this book, A Wonderful Guy. I handed in the manuscript on June 1st, and I immediately started another one, another volume on the next batch of women. And I produce events. I work on the AIDS Walk events. So I've been
privileged for that. That's great.
Thank you. So I've been working on the streaming event for AIDS Walk New York and San Francisco, which I produced with Eric Bergen last year, doing that again this year. I've kept myself busy, and I sort of feel like I'm incredibly grateful that the worst I can say of this pandemic for me personally is sadness and inconvenience, but not worse than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's I'm sorry about the sadness and inconvenience, but thank God.
It's inconvenient for all of us.
It's inconvenient for all of us. As my dear friend David Friedman says, and I quote him all the time, we're all in this together, but we're not in the same boat. Yes, now, my dear friend Carol Channing, to drop a name, she once said, writing a book is a solitary life. But obviously, with the type of books that you've written, you need these other people. You've done the interviews. So I have to up my ante today. You've done all these great interviews. I want to go back to your love of theater. As a little boy, I always like to go back to the 5-year-old self. So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about the 5-year-old Eddie Shapiro.
It's funny that you mentioned 5, because 5 is the year when I saw my first Broadway show. I did grow up in New York, and I did grow up with cast albums in the house. But in my 5th year, that was the year that I saw both Doug Henning's I should say Stephen Schwartz's The Magic Show, starring Doug Henning. So my first Broadway musical was that. But I was also taken to.
Now you're making me feel old.
I was also taken to the Circle in the Square production of St. Jones, starring Lynn Redgrave. And
at 5 years old.
At 5, my mother was an English professor and also. I guess really wanted to see St. Joan and didn't have childcare. But so they took me and she asked me, what I thought of it afterwards. She describes that I sat there slack-jawed the whole time and that I said that I didn't understand a word of it, but that I loved every minute. It's been that way ever since. I still go to theater sometimes where I'm slack-jawed, don't understand a word of it, but I still love it. So...
Well, did your parents instill in you the respect for the theater when you went to the theater? You were told, or I don't know, were you the kind of a kid that would have acted out, or did you know your place when you entered the theater?
It would never even occur to me to act out. I used to, in fact, love to separate from my parents in the theater. I used to look for empty seats and I liked to sit alone if I could, because I wanted people to think I was there by myself. And I always sort of treated it like a religious sanctuary. It was always, and to this day, it is like nails on a chalkboard for me when people don't treat it that way. And I talked to Patti LuPone on that topic, who is, of course, quite famous for having her own responses to people being disruptive during the theater. And she put it in a way that I find the most compelling, because it's sort of, it's easy to say, oh, it's so annoying or how dare they, but how she described it was we all collectively, everybody in the audience has done a lot to be here and to be going into that world, be it our attention, our childcare, our dinner, or our parking, our cost of the theater, all of it. We've done a lot in order to enter into that world. And when you crinkle your water bottle or you talk or your phone rings or whatever it is, you're yanking us all back into this one. And I thought, yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly it.
Do you have an experience for yourself going to the theater where that ended up happening and it was one of the most annoying moments and that took away from your evening of the theater? You tell yours and I'll tell mine.
Oh, I mean, I honestly, I can't think of there's so many examples. I can't think of a solitary one. Actually, I can. But I will say that I do wish I could be somebody who could sort of let it roll off my back, but I can't. I'm so distracted. The worst version of that story was actually not in a theater. It was at the Cafe Carlyle, and Barbara Cook was performing. And there was a woman at the bar who, let's just say she had probably had a few. And she was talking full voice. And I feel so strongly that if I had, I gave her the dirty looks, I shushed, nothing. I felt so strongly that if I said something to her, then I would, of course, be committing the same offense. So I couldn't speak out loud. So I actually went over and I put my hand on top of her mouth, which was, of course, did not quiet her.
Well, now you'd be on the front page of the newspaper if you were to do that. I went to see a production of Orphans. I live in Rockland County. Penguin Rep, one of our local theaters, which I love and support, they were doing Orphans. And in the most pivotal moment of the show, a woman's cell phone went off in the front row. And it was in the bottom of her bag. She couldn't get to it. And it was one of those rings, this was many years ago, that kept getting louder and louder and louder until she answered it. They actually had to stop the show because it was such a distraction. It threw the actors off. It threw the audience off. We were all, as you say, sucked out of that moment and taken over. You have, obviously, a reverence for the theater. Obviously, you would not dedicate your life to chronicling these stories if you didn't. Where does that reverence come from? Did it come from the very beginning of going to the theater? Was there a moment in your life that made you realize the sanctity of what the theater is?
It's an interesting question. And I'm not sure that I can pinpoint it, but I can tell you that I very recently had a confounding thought, literally days ago. I heard the overture for the Fantastics, and I was taken right back to hearing that, playing it on a LP record as a kid, and knowing at the time that or in my soul, that was really important, that I knew this music. And now I think of it and I think, God, there have been so many shows since and through the decades. And why did I decide that was important music? But it was. And I don't know why. I just, that's how I felt. And I used to take out records from the library and pore over the liner notes. I wanted to understand the plots. I wanted to understand the creators, from shows that came long before me. And that's something. It's funny. I've dated people in who are younger than I, who also love the theater, but they seem to love the theater only that they saw. They don't have that much curiosity about it from prior. And I don't know why I'm the way I was or why they are the way they are, but I see the difference.
Well, when I was growing up, I had a mentor, Miss Epps, may she rest in peace. And she instilled in me that every time that I stepped on stage, every time I stepped in front of the camera, that I was carrying the mantle of every great artist that had ever gone before me. And it was my responsibility to keep that mantle held high. And she instilled, and this was I was a kid growing up in Conway, South Carolina. I want to give a shout out to, I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Kirsch. Have you done his show?
I'm only familiar with Charles Kirsch because you made me familiar with Charles Kirsch. And
I've got to get you on his show because
yes, I mean, I see him, I see myself in him absolutely without the glasses. But
I do too. And he's this, for those who did not see that show, it is available on my channel here on YouTube. But he is a 13-year-old kid who has this history of the theater. And, it was so funny because someone once asked him, Sandra Lee, I think it was, if there was any great entertainer that you could have seen in the past, who would it have been? Who would it be? And you and I would probably think of Carol Channing or Ethel Merman, Mary Martin. He said Vivian Siegel in Pow Joey. So where does that come from that it's there? I think there must be some special gene that some of us are born with. Did you do a lot of performing growing up? Did you get the chance? Did you get the opportunity in school to be exposed to the arts?
Yeah. And certainly, as you know, that Carol Channing at the end of her life was very focused on funding for the arts and education. And I was privileged to be able to do a benefit for her foundation for that at one time, because I felt like even in my public elementary school, I was exposed, even in Glee Club, we were singing show tunes. I don't even like the show music. I so prefer, but
I'll pick show tunes any day. So.
And there was a music program, and certainly in junior high, I was doing, Oklahoma and Babes in Arms, so yeah. And it's funny too, in this book, In a Wonderful Guy, asking many of the women in Nothing Like a Dame talk about having grown up really coveting a life on the stage and singing, from childhood. The men, mostly, it wasn't on their radar until High School Musical, and then boom. Very interesting.
Well, when did your writing start? I mean, obviously you're a great writer, but when did that all
I don't
begin?
think that's obvious at all. So thank you.
Well, you are. When did that begin for you?
I started writing, actually, so I mentioned the AIDS Walks before. I spent a number of years as the director of the AIDS Walk in New York and in Los Angeles. And the job was sort of all consuming. And I decided for myself that I needed an outlet, a creative outlet, that had some deadlines on it, because otherwise I would never do it. In order to just put my attentions elsewhere and have a life that wasn't just my job. So I started writing reviews, and for myself, really. But then, once I wrote one and I sent it into Backstage, because I thought, oh, looks like I have something here. And they hired me. And then I started doing features for Backstage, and then books, and here we are. I never planned it. It just sort of evolved. But of course, I had parents who also gave me an excellent education. And as I mentioned, I had a mother who was a literature professor. So
let's start there. What are your thoughts on critics in the theater?
Oh, well, it's so funny, because I think that the critics have reevaluated their own role in the theater. I mean, when you look at the kinds of writing that Brooks Atkinson or Walter Kerr or Frank Rich used to do, and you compare it to the Ben Brantleys and Jesse Greens these days, it's very different writing. And it's almost hard in the New York Times to find something that they really didn't. You have to work to find something that they really didn't like. And that the power of the critics has certainly changed over the years. But do I think, in general, the obvious function of wow, I'm about to spend $150 or more on the theater, I'd like to know from somebody whether or not I should, whether or not that's a good idea.
So you do rely on reviews?
Well, I don't, because I see everything. But the concept of reviews for people to help guide them, sure, yeah, I understand the functionality, whether or not I agree with the practice wholly.
Now, I'm going to ask a very loaded question for you, but as a kid, as a teenager, as a young man, did you gravitate towards leading men or leading women?
I gravitated toward musical theater, and I think it's almost impossible in gravitating toward musical theater not to have a bent toward the divas, the leading ladies. It's in part because it's the way the shows are written, right. In part because of the plethora of material, and in part because when you stop and think about, in the golden age, the leading women, the Ethels and the Marys and the Gwen Verdons, they really worked constantly. Whereas the best known men, yes, John Raitt and Richard Kiley and Alfred Drake were all very well known, but
Richard Kiley's birthday is today. So,
indeed.
Yeah.
But the most famous of them, the men, the Yul Brenners and the Zero Mostel's and Robert Preston's, are really known for their one big hit, but not for their full career in musical theater. So it's easier to love somebody like Gwen Verdon because you can chase a full career of musicals, whereas with Yul Brynner, you can love him in The King and I and you're done.
Now, it is National Women's History Month, which is ending. So I want to start with your book, Nothing Like a Dame. What was the seed that got planted in your head that you were going to write this book? And was it an easy journey for you writing the book?
Oh, no. But the seed, I'm sure you can imagine this, Richard, because I'm sure you imagine you have a similar experience to the one I'm about to describe. So I mentioned Barbara Cook at the Carlisle. I would go to see Barbara Cook quite often, anywhere she played. And when Barbara Cook would perform, she would talk at great length sometimes about the Golden Age. And she would have all kinds of stories and anecdotes. And there were never enough for me. I was always hungry for more. And I looked at Barbara Cook and thought to myself, she's getting up there in years. These stories are not going to be around forever. Let's capture them. So I wrote her a somewhat extravagant letter saying, hey, how would you feel about collaborating on your autobiography? And she responded almost immediately with a very definitive no. But I thought about it, and it was a very sweet no as well. Don't get me wrong. But I thought about it, and I thought, well, why stop at Barbara Cook? There are so many stories out there, and so many people who also can provide links to this other world. So I wrote to her again, and I asked her if she would be willing to be a chapter, and to that she said yes. And then I was off to the races. But I started that particular book by securing the agreement of all of my subjects before I even started, because I wanted to make sure that I had a book and not just an idea. Because if none of them were going to say yes, then it was just an idea. And then you asked if it was an easy process, and the answer again was no, not because courtship was long, although sometimes it was, but because these conversations that I chose to have for both books, the idea was that there were going to be career encompassing conversations. I wanted to talk about, from the first time you had an inkling that you were interested in this thing, to your most recent show and what you thought about the business beyond. So knowing that they were going to be long chapters, long conversations, I had to carve out a lot of time for each one of them. And some of these interviews, would go 10, 12, 14 hours. And in some cases, people like Chita Rivera, busy working. So Chita doesn't have 14 hours to spend in one sitting. So it ends up being 5 sittings over 3 years. And now you multiply that by 20 women, and you add to the fact that I'm a bi-coastal person, so I'm not always in New York, and also sometimes busy working. So it was a long process.
And you did all those interviews in person.
Yes, that was a requirement for me, because I think that there's something, despite the joys of this moment with you right now, I think there's something essential lost.
I totally agree. Absolutely.
In not doing in person. So not only did I really want to do them in person, I wanted to do them in the personal space of the subjects. So either it was their home or dressing room, with very few exceptions, and when there were exceptions, never in public. Because in a restaurant, or, which is where I would do some magazine interviews, that's where those typically happen. There's always distraction. There's always a bit of being on, because you never know who's watching, or the waiter. People are made up. I wanted them in their element so that they would feel at their most relaxed and ready to open up.
So you had a certain number of women that you wanted in the book. Am I correct?
I realized that, given what I just told you about the scope of the chapters, that were going to run long, and given that the publishers would not allow me to print something the size of a phone book, I had to limit it. So I made it 20 women in order to comport with their word count. I decided to create a criteria for how to choose. So the first piece of that was that they all had to be Tony Award winners. Then, as I mentioned, they all had to have full careers in musical theater. So people like, Liza Minnelli, who has worked in musicals, but certainly her career is really on the concert stage and in film, with the occasional appearance on Broadway. I wanted people whose real focus was Broadway, or even an Angela Lansbury, who had another career, but throughout all of her career, Broadway musicals were a staple for her. So full career musical theater. And then, not incidentally, they had to say yes to me, which was not true of everyone, but it was true of most.
Was there a Holy Grail interview that you didn't get that you...
Yes. Anybody with an interest in musical theater can look at this book and say, "Where's Bernadette?" Believe me, I worked hard at that one. I mean, I delivered dog biscuits and cupcakes, and I spoke with everybody I knew who knew her. But ultimately, The feedback that I got was just that Bernadette Peters is not especially interested in talking about herself. I was told, look, if you want to talk to her about dogs, she'd talk to you for hours, but she's just not interested in talking about herself, which I don't begrudge her at all. I'm just sad not to have it.
So did Barbara Cook end up being the first interview that you did on the book?
She was not first, but she was close to first. And then, funnily enough, she's not in it because by the time it was ready for publication, she asked me not to run the chapter because she had decided to do her own autobiography.
With Tom Santopietro, so that came out.
Exactly. But the Barbara Cook chapter remains, and I mentioned that I am doing a follow-up, and I did get permission from her son to run it. So it will appear in the next edition, and I'm so pleased about it because it really was a wonderful and candid interview.
So what was the first interview that you sat down and did on the book?
Donna McKechnie.
Oh, I love.
I think that it just worked out that way. I reached out, but yeah, there was nothing scientific about it. It just, Donna was where I started.
Now, did you come into that interview with Donna with a very specific list of questions? Obviously, you had an idea of what you wanted the book to be, or did the interview end up being a fluid experience with the two of you unfolding as it was happening?
The latter. Every one of the interviews, what I have in front of me is a cheat sheet of their chronology, so that I make sure I'm hitting the shows in the order that we hit them. But beyond that, I don't prepare questions. What I do to prepare is I'm very, very conscientious about looking at what they've said to the press before, either in print or on, these days on video and on interviews, because I want to recognize stories that have happened before. As you well know, Carol Channing could tell a story about when she first, auditioned at William Morris, and tell it again 25 years later, and it's verbatim, exactly the same. So I wanted to be very aware anytime I was hearing a story that had been oft told, so that I could either ask a question to sort of go beyond the story or work around it, because I didn't want to print what's already been in print.
What surprised you the most through the course of the interviews? How long did it take you, all told, from that first interview into the last one that you did?
Well, as I said, it was a protracted experience because of scheduling and having the realities of having to earn a living and that sort of thing. So it probably took just under 5 years. A Wonderful Guide took less time than that, in part because the men were, they signed on a little bit faster, perhaps because I had this one under my belt already. And also the men were not, with a couple of exceptions, even though a few of them had multiple sessions, like we were able to do them. For example, I did Joel Grey twice in the same week. So it didn't have to be, so spread out. So it went a little bit faster, but they're long processes. And then as I mentioned, some of the interviews go so long, and the process of really culling the conversation so that it obviously contains, the most interesting information, but also still has the essence of their voice. Because what I really want the reader to experience is the sort of fly on the wall experience, right? That they're as if they're in the room hearing the conversation. So making sure that the voice comes off on the page is something that I at least endeavor to do. So
when did you know that it was the right time to give birth to the book? I know that you had the number of chapters that you were going to do, but when you knew that it was time to hand it over, that it was no longer in your hands?
Well, as I said, I knew it was going to be, once I set my sights at 20, when I hit my number, then I had it. It was, but you bring up a very interesting point, because letting go is scary, not just because, in fact, the least of it is because it's going to be judged. It's not because it's sort of like, oh, now it's the world's to judge. It's whether or not I've done everything I can to make it as good as I can. And because I am a person like many of us, most of us, who can revel in self-doubt, I always wonder, and I can always look back, and you really have to, there's that great line in 6 Degrees of Separation, where, and of course I'm misquoting, but the character who is an art dealer talks about how when he would go to parent-teacher conferences and see the artwork of the children, and the artwork of the 4th graders were masterpieces, where the 3rd and the 5th were messes, and he wanted to know the genius of the 4th grade teacher, and she said, oh, I just know when to take them away, when to take the pictures away from the kids, when to say stop, it's done, and, I think as a writer, sometimes you can find yourself moving words around and not necessarily enhancing. You're just moving words around, and you have to be willing to say it's done.
And did you find, what was the biggest thing that surprised you about yourself at the end of this process of writing this book?
Wow, about myself. Well, I'll tell you a couple of things that I learned. I don't know if they were necessarily surprises, but they were things to learn. I like to talk, and it was interesting to me in playing back some of the conversations, and this happened early on, but I was like, I screwed that up because I talked. That idea generated from me. And even though that person may have been in agreement and we were having a conversation, it was coming from me. And nobody's, or I should say few people other than my mother and her friends are buying the book because of what I think. The book is about to celebrate the subject. So I had to stop myself from inserting my viewpoint, my opinion. Sometimes anyway, I mean, sometimes to counter them, sure, or to have a discussion, but I had to be careful. So that was something to learn. But another thing that I learned, and forgive the self-aggrandizing nature of what I'm about to say, I walked out of Barbara Cook's house. Always comes back to Barbara Cook. I walked out of her house. And as it probably always comes back to Carol for you, I walked out of Barbara Cook's house, and she took me by both hands and said, you're really good at this. And I am terrible at a compliment. So I sort of shrugged it off and made a joke, and she would have none of it. She held on tight, and she said, no, listen to me. You're really good at this. And I had to walk down West End Avenue thinking to myself, Barbara Cook has been interviewed a few times, and if she's insisting that this one felt different to her, I have to allow that in, and I have to take ownership of what I bring to the table and what I'm good at, and that was an important lesson. But something else, I get asked all the time how I manage to get them to open up to me, the subjects to open up to me as I do, and I can't, of course, be objective on that point, but I will tell you that when I was leaving Carol Channing, she said to me, thank you so much for being so interested. And I said, interested? Carol, isn't everybody who talks to you interested? And she said, well, no.
That sounds like her. That's
yeah.
Did having interviewed these incredible leading ladies, did it change the way that you look at them? Obviously, there's still that adoration for them, but to sit in their presence, I call it basking in that aura that they have. Does it change the way that you look at them?
Absolutely. And it prepared me when I went to go to the Book and the Men, because then I knew I had a different perspective. again, back to Barbara Cook, but one of the first things that she said to me, I asked her what it's like to be Barbara Cook, the sort of aura that you talk about, right? Mm-hmm. Here's the woman who announces a concert at Carnegie Hall and sells it out instantly, or has literally performed at every stage at Lincoln Center. Mm-hmm. So what's it like to be that person at this stage of your life? And she said, it's all, very nice. And I'm no idiot. Or she said, I'm no dummy. I know I'm pretty good at what I do. But I also feel like that's all kind of happening to her. The flowers are for her. But at the end of the day, I get in the car, go home alone, fat, bad knees, my desk is a mess. That's me. And I thought, wow, that separation. Really, you see yourself, you're just a working woman who's got problems just like the rest of us. Another eye-opening moment came from Audra Mcdonald, who, I asked the question of several of these people when they felt like, woo, I made it. I don't have to worry about waiting tables. I'm going to be okay in this business. And Audra said, never. You always wake up. And she sort of paraphrased Judy Garland and said, you always wake up wondering if today's the day they're going to realize that you're a fraud. And whether or not that's true, that she even, I don't think that she was that's false modesty. Obviously, I don't think anybody's going to wake up and decide that Audra Mcdonald's a fraud, but that the thought runs in her mind is just interesting.
Carol Channing once shared a story with me that when she was doing Gentlemen Prefer Blondes on Broadway, she was the toast of Broadway. She was on the cover of Time magazine and Newsweek at the same time. Only the second actress to have Time and Life. I'm sorry, Time and Life, and only the second actress. The first was Tallulah Bankhead, and Dorothy O'Gallen gave her a bad review. And she said she forgot everything she was writing this crest. Dorothy O'Gallen put a pin in her balloon and she deflated. And she reached a point where every night before she walked out on stage, she thought, tonight's the night they're going to find out. And Anita Luce, who wrote Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, came backstage one night. She said, something's different. What's going on? And when Carol told her, she said, listen, for every person who likes you, there are an equal number who don't. Get used to it. The people who like you bought tickets to see you tonight. Those are the people you play to. And she says that changed it for her.
Yeah. That's the yes. And it is interesting and not uncommon for these people in both of these books to say that most of them don't read their reviews, but to say that, no matter how many good reviews they've had, the bad one is the one that sticks with them the most, and can sort of eradicate all of the good ones. And, those are the demons that we all have, right? And the insecurities that we all live with. But again, it's, the perception that I had walking in was that these are all people who've made it to the pinnacle. They're at the top. And what I learned was that they all continue to have the insecurities, and there is no sort of basking. It's just, same insecurity at a different level.
Now, how did your life change after the book came out?
Sorry for the deadly pause. I was trying to think.
No, it'll take as long as you need.
I guess there are a few ways. The one that I had hoped would happen to some degree did, which is that I started being thought of as an expert in the field, which is lovely. And lovely to be called upon to write essays for the Library of Congress or whatever based on this writing. I feel, as I mentioned, I would pore over liner notes. I would also pore over books like this one or these books. And so to feel like I was contributing to the canon for younger people who the Charles Kirsches of the world, that was and remains exciting and vital, and feels like it matters. And then the rest of it, just like Barbara Cook working actor, I'm just working writer doing my thing.
Now, how much time has passed since the last book and you starting work on A Wonderful Guy?
Well, it's 7 years since Nothing Like a Dame came out, and A Wonderful Guy is now coming out. So 7 years from publication date to publication date. It was probably, I toured quite a bit with Nothing Like a Dame. So there was a year and a half in there where I was sort of just focused on that. And even though I had the idea for A Wonderful Guy, I wasn't ready to start it. And then I kind of dipped my toe in the water and I started with my first couple of interviews, but for some reason I wasn't ready. And then I was ready. And when I can't say what changed. I just woke up one day and was ready to dive into it, and I did. And then it was probably 2.5 years more of interviewing and writing to get to June 1st of 2020, which is when I handed in the manuscript.
Now, you have the perfect title for both books. How did you come up with the titles for each one?
I can't say that it was, divine intervention or anything. Tevia's grandmother didn't visit me in a dream, but Nothing Like a Dame just seemed right. And then A Wonderful Guy, I really wanted to stick with a song lyric, and it seemed appropriate to stick with the song lyric from South Pacific. Although for this next one, I wasn't going to go with Bali High. So the next one, we're shifting shows, and we're shifting to Dolly. It will be It Takes a Woman.
That's the next one?
Yep.
Oh, good for you. That's wonderful. So with the new book, how did this one get started? And I want to ask you, what is the biggest change either in yourself or in the industry itself since the last book came out and getting ready to embark on this one?
I don't like answering this question because it makes me sad. The change in the industry itself, that is perhaps most profound, is that social media and Facebook have become so much a part of our lives that all of the actors, or a lot of the actors, talk about social media in ways that they're not happy about. That either they've decided to be completely off it, or they see the necessity of being on it, but they kind of hate it. And that their interactions with fans have changed completely. They feel, and I'm generalizing, of course, but that there's less genuine interaction, and there's more about selfies and branding. And that's a change to the communion that exists between audience members and actors, not just sort of, a stage door experience, but also just the relationship between audience and performer. So that makes me sad, and I don't see us coming back from it, unfortunately. But that's a big one. And then something else that I can't say is a change between these two books, but it's a progressive thing that perhaps coming back from this pandemic may somehow change, is the monetary life of an actor. And some of these men have talked about that it's really, really hard to maintain a life as a Broadway performer, and that's why so many of them have sought out continual television work, and all of them say repeatedly that they'd rather be on stage. Most of them. Will Chase is the one exception who loves doing television, but all of them would rather be on stage. But they see the necessity of making money elsewhere. They have financial responsibilities. They're fathers, and still another change in the, I can't say that I've changed, but I can't be objective on that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to touch upon several of the themes that you just brought up, and I want to start with social media. Obviously, social media is at a completely different place than it was 7 years ago. How have you embraced it? What have you resisted with social media? And what are the pluses and minuses across the board as far as you're concerned?
Actually, you know what, Richard? I will answer that question, but before I do, I wanna mention one other change that's very, very recent. But the notion of diversity in the theater is so present right now, and in the people who I'm talking to for It Takes a Woman. That's a conversation that we're having that I didn't have as much. I mean, obviously, I had it with actors with people like Raúl Esparza and the African-American actors I spoke to, but I wasn't necessarily talking about it with white people. And now I am.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting. And as it should be, that it should be on the radar of I mean, just talking to Charlotte D'Amboise about how she played Anita in Jerome Robbins' Broadway, and how, while she's grateful to have danced it, she is sort of appalled that she played it, and understands that that's of the time, but that, you know, that's not how we thought then, and it is how we're thinking now. So that's a big change, and I think a necessary change for the better. You asked me about
social media.
My relationships with social media, and I'm a bit of a Luddite. I use Facebook. I mean, Nothing Like a Dame and a Wonderful Guy have a Facebook page, and I use Facebook to promote. And sometimes I will use Facebook to speak, Facebook Messenger to speak to some of the actors, but I'm not a big poster. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not promoting something, and promoting sounds so crass, it's really about, when you're coming out with a book, it's not about making money. It's not about, sell. It's about letting the world know that this thing exists.
Exactly. Thank you.
And spreading the information. So social media is certainly useful for that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not on Instagram, or I have an account, which I don't think I've ever posted on. Mm-hmm. I'm not great.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk now with where we are with the pandemic. And I know your book was completed before then, and because of the pandemic, it's also affected you in terms of when the book is coming out. It's gotten delayed, as is the case with a lot of books that are coming out at this time. How do you, and I'm asking a question that is just speculation, how do you anticipate or see the theater coming back after all of this?
I believe that in terms of, look, we just had something happen today, that Diana the Musical announced their reopening dates, and their ticket structure and pricing is exactly the same as it was pre-pandemic. They're not looking at it from a point of view of selling fewer seats. They're not looking at it from a point of view of selling seats at a different price point to make theater more accessible. They're just sort of going back to business as usual. Mm-hmm. Do I think that most commercial producers are going to attempt something similar? I do. And do I think that most commercial producers are going to be successful? Very, because I think that even Phantom of the Opera is going to be selling out because people are clamoring to get back into the theaters. But I also think that, or I hope with all of my heart and soul, that the conversations about diversity continue, not just because of the obvious that the place at the table is so long overdue, but because for theater to remain vital, it's got to be telling the stories of the people, not just sort of so that people, when they go to theater, they connect with the characters on stage. They connect with those experiences. They connect with those lives in a way that they then feel something differently about their own life. And as much as I love Mame in Beekman Place, and I can't wait to see her on Broadway again, we have to really be thinking globally in terms of storytelling. So I hope that that's what happens.
Mm-hmm. There was a time when shows like I Do were very popular. Smaller scaled musicals, romance. Do you think that those types of shows will come back? Because Broadway has gotten so big and massive that I feel personally that it's gotten away from the heart of theater and more to the realm of spectacle and Vegas.
I think that you think that sort of, but I don't think that you think that wholly if you really think about it, because I think that, I mean, obviously I'm not inside of your head, but yes, so I understand,
Dangerous place to be.
when you think in terms of, the Moulin Rouges of the world and but also if you look at some recent shows on Broadway, Fun Home, The Band's Visit, Dear Evan Hansen, even Come From Away, which are, Come From Away costs as much as Cats cost on Broadway, which is insane. But that story is told with actors moving chairs around on a stage, and playing multiple parts and changing accents.
And it's magical. It's the magic.
Exactly. When those, or the revival of The Color Purple also was, essentially the Meunier Chocolate Factory production of The Color Purple. When it works, audiences do come and embrace it, and maybe it doesn't have the same tourist appeal as a Moulin Rouge and doesn't have the potential of running for a decade, but it's certain. Well, actually, Dear Evan Hansen looks poised to be running for a decade, and perhaps Come From Away too. So it can happen. It's just gotta, as always, it's alchemy. It's lightning in a bottle, and what do you capture? But I do hope, to your point, that every success of A Band's Visit, a Fun Home, a Dear Evan Hansen, encourages a Next to Normal, encourages producers to realize that they don't all have to look like Wicked.
Well, I think of you as this vessel that you allow these people to tell their stories through you, and beautifully, I might add. But looking back with where we are again with the pandemic and everything, obviously, this idea of fans meeting the stars at the stage door is going to be missing from the theater, at least for some time. Hopefully it'll come back at some point. What are your hopes and dreams for the next year as far as theater coming back?
I mean, my hopes and dreams probably are fantasies, but my hopes and dreams are, it's so obvious, right? The entire industry has been out of work. And while we tend to think of actors first and foremost, and of course I do because they're the subjects of my book, when I think about dressers and I think about ushers, I mean, ushers, even though they're union, those are people who've been working in those theaters for 40, 50 years, and they make very little. And what the hell are they living on right now? So my fantasy is that every theater opens and is at capacity immediately, but it's a fantasy. But then even, the actors, lots of them have been able to pivot. But several of the actors I talked to during this pandemic are quite nervous about their own solvency. And I don't think that's just neuroses. Because, as you say, even when we come back, it may very well come back differently. And audiences, even though producers are certainly ready to get the ball rolling, audiences may not be quite ready. And if, God forbid, we do have another surge that prolongs our ability to gather, don't even like to think of what that's going to mean. But
I see a fourth book in your future. I see you really writing a book celebrating those people behind the scenes, the ushers. They're great stories.
The dressers,
every aspect, the people that are working the concessions and the merchandise and everything. What was the last show? We talked at the beginning of the interview where you began. What was the last show? And Moulin Rouge was the last show that I saw on Broadway before everything shut down. I had tickets, and I still do, for Company and The Music Man, and I'm anticipating seeing both of those shows. But what was the last thing that you saw?
Well, sadly, it's so inauspicious because I am bicoastal. I was on March the 12th, on March 13th, I was due to fly back to New York, and I had 14 shows lined up over the next week and a half, all of which, of course, were canceled. So I hadn't been here since January, and the last thing I was supposed to see was off Broadway at Second Stage, Bob Carroll, Ted and Alice, that musical version of the movie. And for the first time in my life, I threw my back out completely, and I was in such pain that I didn't even go to the last thing I had a ticket to that played.
Oh, wow. Well, I am hoping and praying. The book is going to be coming out soon, everyone. It is available on Amazon through Oxford Press. Get this book. Get both of these books. Reach out to your friends. I always say go out and do something nice for somebody else without expecting anything in return. Buy 2 copies of this book. Keep one for yourself. And go to your Facebook friends list, and let's say the 4th name that pops up, you buy a book with them as well. And they'll thank you for it. Trust me, they will.
But what if the 4th name that pops up on your Facebook feed is Jonathan Groff, and he's already in the book, so he doesn't need a copy?
Well, he can give the book to someone else that would appreciate the book. And he saved a little money in doing so.
There you go.
But it's still paid for. I want to thank everybody for being here today. I can't believe we're already at the end of our show. Eddie, it's a real pleasure sitting there and talking with you. I want to thank everyone for being here today. If you enjoyed the show, and I hope you did, whatever platform you're watching this on, whether it be YouTube or you're listening to the podcast later, please leave a review, leave a rating, subscribe to the channel if you'd like. I'd also like everyone to know that tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock, Creativity in the Age of COVID with Dr. Bloom and myself. And we've got some very special guests tomorrow. Robert De Niro is going to be on the show, and Jack Nicholson, or at least a facsimile thereof. It is April Fool's Day. So join us tomorrow. You never know who's going to show up. I always stress to reach out to people, especially now. I said it at the beginning of the show, and I'm going to say it again. As my dear friend David Friedman says, we're all in this together, but we're not in the same boat. And you never know what someone else is going through right now. So please, please, please reach out to those that you love, because you just never know. Eddie, I want to give you the final word today. Anything that you want to say about anything that we talked about that you want to expound upon, anything that we didn't talk about that you wish we had, or just any message that you want to give to everyone who's watching right now. And again, thank you for all that you do. I truly appreciate it.
Wow. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the time to talk. One thing that I didn't say that I will, this book, A Wonderful Guy, that's coming out, and Nothing Like a Dame Before, it only exists because all of these people were willing to be forthcoming with their life stories, with their feelings, with their time. And I feel like for all of us, that's right. The more willing we are to share and communicate and be open.
Be our authentic selves.
I'm sorry?
We all have to be our authentic selves.
Right. So the more we show up willing to be our authentic selves and share of that, I think the closer we come to the spring that's promised, this rebirth, as we're vaccinated and get to step out of our houses again. So
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eddie. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and an even greater April. It's right on the horizon. We'll see you later. Thanks.